South Korea, a country surrounded by historic powers that has throughout the centuries found itself in constant danger. At times of conflict, compromise has been a choice that has produced mixed results for its people. Sometimes, compromise has spared the country further conflict, and a resulting peace has presented economic opportunities. And through these opportunities, the nation has transformed itself into the world's 11th largest economy. On the other hand, at times compromise has kept it vulnerable to bigger or more hostile neighbors such as Japan, Russia, North Korea, and China, making it one of the most geographically disadvantaged nations on Earth. In 2017, South and North Korea were on the brink of war. Now, they have become less hostile towards each other and are discussing to finally denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Would the compromise produced by these negotiations help resolve or perpetuate the conflict?
전당 전군 전민이 주체혁명의 최후 승리를 하루빨리 앞당겨올 배심과 신심 드높이 제국주의자들이 온갖 위협과 광란적인 도전을 짚으시며 전인민적 총진구를 과감히 전개해 나가고 있는 자엄한 투쟁 속에서 역사적인 조선노동당 제7차 대회를 진행하게 됩니다.
To better understand what's brought South Korea to the most recent nuclear standoff, let's start in 1894, specifically the Japanese and Qing-Chinese conflict during the Sino-Japanese War, which was fought over the Korean peninsula between China and Japan. These two powers struggled throughout the 19th century to wield influence with the Korean people, who, as a result, had torn allegiances. Korean traditionalists supported China's influence, wishing to maintain its status as a Chinese tributary state, while younger, less conservative Koreans pushed modernization and supported the influence of Japan. This conflict became further complicated in 1895. The Japanese government ordered the assassination of Queen Myeongsong. Also known as Queen Min, she had publicly opposed Japan's attempt to expand into Korea. This action produced an angry response among the Korean people, who, as a result, felt less willing to work with the Japanese. In 1897, Korea sought independence from Japan, and along with it came the Gwangmu Reform to modernize and develop a new empire. This reform process was short-lived though, for soon the Russo-Japanese War happened, and in the treaties that followed Japan's victory, concessions were made by Russia, and even the United States, to keep the peace and prevent further Japanese expansion. But instead, the compromises produced further Japanese interference in Korea. In fact, with its soldiers stationed in Seoul, it was the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905 that resulted in Korea becoming a protectorate of the Japanese Empire. A compromise forced upon the Korean people that soon turned into a disaster. This compromise treaty led to Japan slowly integrating into the Korean government system. In 1907, Emperor Gojong abdicated the throne to his son Sunjong. His reign lasted only 3 years following a series of protocols and treaties that led to Japan abolishing the empire. Japan treated the Koreans like they were second-class citizens. The Koreans were forced to accept and assimilate into Japanese culture. This caused the Koreans to want to be free from the Japanese. But this occupation continued all the way until 1945. The United States and its allies defeated Japan in World War II. The defeat of the Japanese in Korea happened in the last days of the war. In fact, it was only 6 days before Japan surrendered that the USSR declared war, and subsequently invaded the Korean peninsula. In a compromise, in order to free Soviet expansion, the 38th parallel was agreed upon to separate American from Soviet spheres of influence. Eventually, in 1948, a treaty was made to split the Korean peninsula for good to keep the Cold War peace. Again, a compromise produced mixed results. The pro-Soviet North was called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the pro-American South, the Republic of Korea. The Soviets selected communist Kim Il-sung to take control of the northern section of Korea. The Americans selected free market dictator Simon Rhee. Almost immediately, this compromise produced mixed problems because the North was reluctant in making the agreement. The North was in favor of taking control of the entire peninsula. Kim Il-sung was a believer in reunification. He made plans to invade the South. He traveled to Moscow and saw Stalinism in person. Where the people of the Soviet Union worshipped their leader Joseph Stalin, he dreamed of ruling such a state. While there, he asked Moscow and then Beijing for assistance, and received it in the form of approval and weapons, returning with tanks and artillery to wage war. They shot them. 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. It was at that point that I realized the communists were not our brothers. I was suddenly shocked and afraid. This was said by a man named Han, who at the time was in a concentration camp in North Korea. The Korean War was the result of North Korea's plan to take control of the full peninsula. The US and the Soviets had made a compromise that they would leave the countries in 1949 and leave them to govern themselves. This compromise caused a huge conflict because one side had no intentions of living up to its own obligations. As soon as the Americans left South Korea, with the help of the Soviets and China, the North invaded the South. They took over most of South Korea until they were stopped at Busan, Luckily for the South Koreans, the newly formed United Nations decided to take action and help with their liberation. Thus, the Korean War began on June 25, 1950. The United Nations force attacked through the South's Incheon harbor that June, eventually capturing all of North and South Korea and reunifying the peninsula. North Koreans fled to China, which then decided to send its own soldiers to fight on behalf of the communist regime. China and North Korea together then drove out the UN force back into South Korea. In 1953, North and South Korea agreed to sign a ceasefire, which holds to this day. Although Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in planned to end the war altogether through denuclearization, no formal declaration of peace has ever been signed. Technically, this means the war is still happening now. The compromise gave the northern half of the peninsula to North Korea and the southern half to South Korea. It was a compromise that has brought relative peace, as no full-scale war has happened since, and so South Korea has flourished economically and politically into a prosperous, independent democracy. But North Korea has broken the agreement on many occasions, building infiltration tunnels into the south and planning full-scale invasions. This has been an uneasy peace for decades. In 1994, at a time when the USSR no longer existed to sponsor North Korea, Kim Il-sung died and was replaced by his son Kim Jong-il. Without help from Russia, there was a loss of food and imported goods. North Korea was facing serious problems. The North Korean famine killed hundreds of thousands in 4 years. Foreign countries had to send rations to the people so they could survive. It was revealed that North Korea was spending less money on food for its people and more money on nuclear weapons programs. And it had visions of using such weapons to someday reunify the two Koreas. After the United States learned of this news, there would be another compromise, an agreement that North Korea would stop the funding of nuclear weapons development to feed its people instead. This compromise may have slowed down the nuclear weapons program, but the North Korean regime had secretly kept the program going with uranium enrichment. This was the reason why George W. Bush declared North Korea as a member of his axis of evil. In the 2000s, South Korea helped finance the construction of the Kaesong Industrial Complex just across the border in North Korea in an attempt to forge closer ties by manufacturing goods together. Each year, North Korea would earn roughly $90 million from the arrangement. The money was meant to benefit the country and its people. In reality, North Korea used the revenue to fund missile tests. In 2016, South Korea withdrew from the initiative in protest. Again, the North Korean regime is in desperate need of money.
There was this air raid siren going on outside for a missile from North Korea. I don't know if it's real or not.
Now, that missile flew for about 15 minutes. It's the second missile test that North Korea has launched just in the past 4 days.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself.
New tonight, another daring defection on the Korean Peninsula. We're now learning more about a harrowing border crossing by a North Korean soldier and what he may have endured to reach safety. Brian Todd is standing by.
Today, North Korea is again in the world spotlight. From the North participating as one with the South in the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics, to holding possible peace talks with the US and its allies, US President Donald Trump, China, and the UN imposed new sanctions and restrictions on North Korea, thus forcing North Korea to seek other options besides isolation.
And brother, so please don't forget and don't withdraw US troops from the Korea. Right after you move from the Korea, then North Korea will march and then they will be here.
The problem with all that is everybody, that's all sort of like 3 or 4 steps away, right? What matters in the next year or so to 5 years is, do the North Koreans actually verifiably dismantle, right, disarm in a way that they've been talking about for the last 4 months, right?
It is hard to say if these actions will produce positive results or not. North Korea is currently run by Kim Jong-un, and he has continued the controversial policies of his father and grandfather. In recent news, the leaders of both North and South Korea have started talks about ending the armistice and denuclearization of the whole Korean peninsula. We don't know what will happen exactly in the near future. Whether compromise out of these means resolves the conflict or perpetuates it remains to be seen. Even though it is hard to determine what both North and South Korea would do, there is always a hope that someday the right compromise will be struck and it will produce a lasting peace.